wanted to introduce you all to Ed Wehrle, who is a recent author of a book. Ed, what is the title of that book for us, please?
The book is actually titled, and let me make sure I got the full title. The title is Breaking Babe Ruth, Baseball's Campaign Against Its Biggest Star. So, it's sort of designed to be an eye-catching title, obviously, but I think it's an accurate title as well, especially that part about baseball's campaign against its biggest star. And obviously we can talk a little bit about exactly what that means.
So, Ed, first, can you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how did you get into the book writing business?
Well, sure. So I'm an historian. I'm a trained historian. I did a PhD at the University of Maryland. My field is actually international relations, so not very oriented towards sports, although there is a sports and international relations field. I've written on the Vietnam War, but also, I'm interested in sports. I'm interested in baseball, and I thought it would be a nice kind of departure to look at these other issues relating to sports. My plan was to look at sports writers and maybe write something about sports writers, and then I kind of got the Babe Ruth bug a little bit, especially looking at the way that sports writers depicted Ruth, and that opened up a lot of questions, and I kind of went down the rabbit hole, followed some of those questions, and kind of developed this thesis, this argument about Ruth's career and how the baseball establishment treated him, which quite often was pretty doggone bad. Oh, and I should mention as well, Brent, that I'm a professor of history at Eastern Illinois University in Charleston, Illinois. I've been there 17 years.
Excellent. So, okay, so you kind of dipped into this next question. Let's go a little bit deeper into kind of the premise of your book and the types of topics you cover in relation to the book.
Sure. I think, first of all, the key thing to understand is context, right? So I'm an historian. I'm kind of interested in the broader context. So you set Ruth in the broader context as he emerges in his career. He starts playing baseball professional baseball, right before World War I. Baseball, at that point, professional baseball, is beset by a series of very serious, grave problems. Three major problems, so easy to remember, three major problems. First of all, player strife, player labor strife. You've got a very draconian labor system. You've got basically players do not have the right to strike. They do not have the right to move to other teams. So you've got this very tight kind of labor system. There's also a lot of gambling surrounding the game and all kinds of questions about gambling. That, of course, blows up in 1919 with the Black Sox scandal, but gambling is always there, and there's always if you went to any ballpark, probably in any city in the major leagues, right before World War I, during World War I, or immediately after World War I, you'd see some gambling. There would be people, running numbers, taking bets right through the stands, and there's always the attendant possibility that a player, as happened in 1919, would, be bought off. So there's that hanging over baseball. And then the third problem, rowdyism, violence within the game, in the stands, among the players toward umpires. These three problems are really devastating to baseball. And there's all kinds of efforts by baseball's maybe so-called reformers among the establishment to bring order to the game. And the game is not a particularly prosperous game. It's only when Ruth emerges as a big star in 1920 that baseball starts to look like you can make an awful lot of money here. And indeed, it's Ruth who opens up this new future of tremendously big stadiums, big stars, marketability, modern sports. But, Ruth is kind of associated with some of that disorder of the first 2 decades of the 20th century baseball. He has a temper. It passes quickly. It's nothing compared to the tempers of other players like Ty Cobb, who's nearly psychotic at times. He played for the Boston Red Sox, and Boston is a city heavily associated with gambling, and he's sympathetic to labor unions. He was a member of the last labor union before the Marvin Miller Group, the Players' Fraternity. He went to meetings. His roommate was a major leader of the organization. So Ruth was known to have sympathy for player organizations. All of that really worried baseball. Ruth is also very outspoken about the reserve clause. He is more than willing to criticize baseball's really unfortunate. I mean, compared to other businesses, you would do better. You'd have more rights as a plumber, as a factory worker in New York City than you had labor rights as a baseball player during this time. Ruth was more than willing, especially in his contract negotiations, to point out those, that system and how skewed it was against baseball players. So I think by 1920, baseball, and I'm sorry to keep going on here, Brent. Remember, I'm a college professor, so I talk in 50-minute increments. Ruth was a threat to the system, even as he brought so much prosperity and excitement and charisma. And this guy was unprecedented, absolutely unprecedented then or now in terms of charisma and just the sheer excitement that he brought and the large numbers of crowds that he brought. But baseball realized they needed to control this guy. The big threat, Brent, I think, in the early 1920s was that Ruth would break away from Major League Baseball and maybe establish his own league, maybe join another league. And there had been a pretty serious threat to baseball starting in about 1913 called the Federal League. That was beaten back before World War I. But then there are these shipbuilders leagues during World War I that were also a threat. So they really want to contain Ruth. They want to make sure that he knows who's boss, and they worked hard to send him a lot of messages and to contain him, and really, in a fairly brutal manner. One more point, then I'll shut up, and that's that sports writers played a very important role here. They're the ones who often framed the way that the public saw athletes like Ruth, and they started to develop this image of Ruth as sort of an overgrown adolescent who wasn't in control of himself. The drinking, the partying, all of that stuff. I think, as your family has noted, widely exaggerated. How he could play so effectively if he was supposedly partying all the time. All of that's just exaggerated. There's no real evidence for all of that. But that was part of the campaign to kind of demean and contain Ruth. And that campaign continued through to the 1930s. So there's the essential premise of the book in that breaking Babe Ruth theme.
Thank you, Ed. So help us understand, why would the media want to do this with Babe? What would drive them to do that?
The media is actually baseball writers, sports writers, actually really controlled by the baseball establishment in the sense that, in very real terms, they were paid by teams. So they're not making very much working for local newspapers. Instead, what they do is when they travel, the teams pay for their travel. When they go to hotels, they stay at first-rate hotels. The teams pay for that. Teams pay for meals. Teams pay for alcohol. They are, in a very real sense, on the payroll of Major League Baseball teams. There's no question about that. And sometimes that was pointed out to the sports writers when they wrote something negative about a team. Oftentimes a manager or a general manager would grab a sports writer, at least in one case, say, hey, look, you're a member of this team. Who are you pretending? That you're an independent operator here. You're a member of this team. So they had to chirp the line of the baseball establishment. Likewise, I think most sports writers bought into the reform vision. They wanted a stable game free of labor strife, free of rowdyism, free of gambling, a game that would appeal to middle-class audiences. That was the real goal, to cultivate middle-class audiences, women, bring them to the ballpark. That was essential to this reformer's goal. Ruth was going to make that happen. At the same time, they wanted to make sure that he made it happen in the right way. He's an independent operator. They want to bring him to heel.
Great. Thank you. So, it's interesting because the family has always felt that Major League Baseball's had kind of a love-hate relationship with the Babe.
Absolutely. That's the best way to describe it, Brent, a love-hate relationship. They're dependent on this guy for all the money that he's pulling in. And when he even goes to other cities, teams like the St. Louis Browns, who weren't drawing a lot of attendance, Ruth shows up, suddenly the stands fill up. So everyone depends on him, but they also resent that dependence. And they resent having to listen to this guy they consider uneducated, right? He's not from the upper classes. Where is he? He's from the working classes. He's from, really, the impoverished classes, which makes the story all the more remarkable, Brent, how this guy, whose family abandoned him, turned out to have this kind of wonderful humanity that I think was one of the reasons people sensed that humanity. They understood that humanity. The sports writers helped cultivate that image a bit, but it was really Ruth. So people really buy into that. But the fame and the adoration that this guy had unsettled baseball's management. They didn't want a charismatic Ty Cobb on their hands. Put it that way. Cobb was enough trouble. The last thing they wanted was a very charismatic Cobb on their hands.
So it's interesting because everything that you're saying makes sense, but honestly, this is kind of new information for us. How did you acquire all this insight?
Well, it kind of started off, as I said, reading the sports writers' accounts here, and then trying to think of here, Ruth is this incredible hero. Why are they treating him so poorly? In 1925, he started criticizing the manager of the New York Yankees, not without good reason. I mean, stuff that LeBron James did, and got away with it. The manager was fired, and LeBron was able to pick his own manager, coach was fired, and LeBron was able to pick his own hand-picked coach. As Ruth began to criticize Miller Huggins, who later on he had a good relationship with, but not in 1925. He was suspended by Huggins, supposedly for partying too much. And then when Ruth threatened to quit the Yankees and maybe quit baseball, the press started reporting on the fact that Ruth wasn't living with his wife, was living with another woman who, of course, is your grandmother and or great grandmother. I'm sorry, Brent. And this was a very important relationship. Ruth was really reliant upon Claire Merritt at that point. And no other public figure was treated this way, to have their girlfriend exposed in public, pictures of her, and dismissive pictures of her, that type of thing. And then the minute Ruth agreed and came to terms with the Yankees and apologized, was forced to apologize, suddenly Claire's name disappeared from the media, not to return again till 1929, when, of course, Ruth married Claire. And a very important relationship that maybe we can talk about a little bit.